Thank you all for joining us for the Imposter Syndrome Workshop. Joining us today is Dr. Richard Gardner, Assistant Professor in the Department of Management, Entrepreneurship, and Technology. Today we'll discuss what imposter syndrome is, who experiences imposter feelings, and learn strategies for overcoming imposter syndrome. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Gardner to get us started. Thanks for being here.
Great, thank you. I'm the one in the red shirt here. So thanks for letting me be here. If you guys could do me a favor, maybe in the chat, because I can see the chat up on this screen. Just write in the chat what your degree is, what if you're a PhD or a master's student, and what it's in. We have David here. He's an astronomy PhD student. So just so I get an idea of what you guys are doing, if you can just put in the chat there, and I'll see that as we get started here. All right. Okay. Great. Cool. Excellent. Yeah, Jamie's in he had my class last night, MBA, MIS student there. Perfect. Great. Yeah, mental health. This should be right down that alley there, mental health counseling. Awesome. Okay. Well, today we're talking about the imposter syndrome and careers. And this is actually something that is, I think, pretty important for academics and academia. A lot of imposter research has actually used academics as their little sampling pool. Because maybe you guys can relate to this, I don't know, but I know when I was in my PhD program, there's a lot of social comparison that goes on. There's a lot of insecurity. There's a lot of ambiguity. You don't even know if your advisor likes you, perhaps. So it really kind of fuels these feelings of like, do I really kind of belong here? And that's what is the imposter syndrome. So we'll talk about what it is, when does it occur, and how to effectively cope. So there's actually a lot of, maybe kind of commentary writing about this in some journals that you might be familiar with, so like in the Chronicle of Higher Education or in Science or in Nature. I just have links to these, and they can share my slides, I think, with you as well. If you guys are interested in linking or reading some academics and their experience with imposter syndrome, there's links, hyperlinks to these here. But yeah, this is definitely something in academics. So let me give you an example of this. This is actually, this is a picture here of MIT. So they're in Boston. And MIT, they have a Facebook group for incoming students. So these are incoming freshmen. And as you can imagine, the incoming freshmen to MIT are pretty accomplished students. Like they're high school, all of that stuff, they have been experiencing. There might be valedictorians, they have these GPAs that are above 4.0, and I never understand how that works. Well, I kind of do, but I never experienced that myself. But these are really accomplished students. They come into MIT, they actually find that everybody else is pretty accomplished as well. So it kind of threatens their sense of self here. And this Facebook group for incoming students, these are actual comments that were on there. So this one student says, I know I've been admitted to MIT, but I don't know if I'm actually smart enough to perform in this fabulous school with you amazing people. Then somebody responds to this thread and they say they want to dislike it. They don't even want to say thumbs up. If they had the thumbs down, they would do that and say dislike for not recognizing your own awesomeness, but like because I feel pretty much the same way. So somebody's validating those feelings. And then somebody else on the same thread says, I keep reading about these national scholars and competition people. I'm just a guy from Arizona. Not that I haven't performed well or worked hard, I have, but still. And what is interesting to me about this is, if I were one of these students and I was admitted into MIT and I was planning to go there, I would feel so good about myself, I think. I'd be like, oh yeah, this is a very prestigious school. Certainly your parents would probably be proud of you and all of that stuff. And there should be all these psychological benefits to this group membership, to a very prestigious group. However, these people are not getting those psychological benefits. In fact, it's harming them to be a part of this prestigious group here. And so this is what we call this imposter syndrome. So this is if we're kind of use the technical definition here, this is when somebody demonstrates the ability and behaviors of group membership, but experience self-deprecation and self-doubt to the extent that they feel like imposters. And this can be related to other concepts, maybe even perfectionism or feel of failure. But basically, these are people who have actually performed well. Everybody thinks they're great, except for them. They're the ones that feel like a fake. They're the ones that feel like I don't belong here. And it's just a matter of time before they find out that I slipped through the cracks somehow. So I've done research on this a little bit. I'm actually still doing some research on it currently, which I'll be happy to talk about. But here's one of the things that imposters typically do, and it has to do with attribution. So some of you that might, and I should say, feel free if you have a question, put it in the chat, or maybe unmute yourself or something, or use the raise your hand function. I want this to be somewhat interactive. So if you have a question or anything, feel free to go ahead and ask it as we go along. So here's the thing about, here's one of the things that imposters do, and it has to do with differences of their attribution, or what they attribute their successes and failures to. We call this internal and external attribution. And here's what typically happens is, and I think about this with my own students, if they do really, really well on an exam, or if they do really, really badly on an exam, they're going to attribute their success or their failure to certain things. And they might be internal or external factors. Here's an example. Here's what a typical person says when they did really well on an exam. They attribute their success to themselves, to an internal attribution. They say, I worked really hard. I'm really smart. This is what my students do when they do really well. It's never, oh, Professor Gardner did such a great job teaching me and all that kind of stuff. It's no. I earned this and I worked really hard. And if they do badly on the exam, well, it's never their fault. It's not because they didn't work hard. It's because my teacher's horrible, or my roommates kept me up all night. My dog ate my homework. It's an external attribution. And that's a normal person. Normal people, this is kind of a self-selection or self-serving bias, where we attribute our successes to internal things and we attribute our failures to external things. And that's pretty normal. But this is what imposters do. When they do really well, they say, I got lucky. People helped me study. I'm surrounded by this infrastructure here that was my success. So they don't really internalize this success. They attribute it to external factors. And if they do poorly on something, they actually internalize their failures. And they say, you know what, I'm not smart. Maybe this is just too hard for me. And that is what happens. That's one of the aspects of imposterism, is this idea of attribution here. And this is actually something that we see a lot now, even in sports. People are talking about this. Who's that tennis player? The women's tennis player. She actually is kind of taking a break from tennis a little bit. No, it's not Serena. It's Naomi. Naomi Osaka. She actually just put a little tweet out there kind of saying, I'm struggling with this imposter thing. And everybody else is thinking, you're one of the best tennis players in the world. Like, how can you not internalize your successes? But she has a problem doing that. So what can imposter syndrome lead to? What are some of the outcomes of this? Unfortunately, people who feel like imposters, sometimes they withdraw. And they can withdraw mentally, or they can even withdraw physically. And this can be somewhat premature. So they might internalize this idea of, you know what, I don't belong here. And so they self-select themselves out of whatever program they may be in. So I'll give you an example. When I was doing some research with this, we were doing some qualitative interviews, and we were doing this with students, and these were not students here at UNLV. They were at a different school, but they were accounting students. And this accounting program that they're in was a top-ranked program. It's kind of like an MIT of accounting. And they're kind of always nationally ranked in the top 2 or 3. And they're in this prestigious program. And we were interviewing these students, and one student just said, you know what, I did badly on one exam, the first exam. And then they just totally withdrew from class. Now, not physically, they actually didn't physically withdraw from the class. They stayed in the program, but they just said, you know what, like I didn't feel like I could hack it or anything, even though they had demonstrated all the capabilities to belong and be admitted into this prestigious program. And so he actually told us, he's like, you know what I do actually is I play video games. That's what I do. And so my roommates don't know that I'm not studying. He's like, I actually leave the apartment, go to campus with my computer. All my roommates, they all think I'm studying all day. I just go to the library and I play video games and then I come home. And that's what he did. Now, this person obviously had demonstrated capability before, but since they're feeling this way, they kind of had this one hiccup in their exam, and it just formed the pieces. So I'm actually kind of curious. This is where I do want to hear from you guys, and feel free again to either raise your hand or even just use the chat. But have any of you felt this way in this audience here of kind of our grad students, or mostly grad students? I think we have a few undergrads in here as well, but have any of you felt this way? And if so, why do you think? Why do you think this happens? What are some of the triggers for it? So yeah, I'm curious. What are your experiences with the imposter, if any at all? And I always know to give a little bit of time. People might be using the chat and stuff, but. Yes, that's why I am here, from Jeannie. Jeannie, can you explain a little bit more about that? So you feel like an imposter, but like why? Why do you think this? Why do you think you might be feeling this way?
Feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Yeah, for sure. You can unmute yourself if you'd like to elaborate. Go ahead.
I'm not sure. Just I haven't been in school in a very long time, and I am doing well in my classes, but I still feel, just kind of overwhelmed and very much procrastinating.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, good. Yeah. So even though you're doing well, you still don't quite feel like you're doing well, perhaps. Ryan also says, that he's felt this way, not sure where it comes from. Exactly. Well, excuse me. I just had my COVID booster yesterday, so I'm like surviving today. But okay, let me read this other comment here. This comes from Samantha. She says, there are times that I still feel this way when I am talking to some members of my cohort. It's hard to stop comparing yourself to others. For me, it comes from high expectations of myself, natural urge to socially compare myself to others. Yeah, this is actually something that is a big deal. This is one of these things that, and of course we know this, you guys know this better than most, where academics tends to be a pretty social comparative process. Question, when you were recruited to UNLV as a student, yeah, oh, and here's the other comment here from Alyssa saying, when I feel it the most is when I'm talking to others in my school. And that's really great. That's actually pretty consistent with some of the research that I've done. So I got a question. When you were recruited to UNLV, did anybody ever, like, I imagine you probably thought, well, what happens after I go to school at UNLV? And I imagine if your experience was like mine, they might say, well, here's our recent graduates. Here's their placements. Here's their jobs. Here's the academic positions they have. Now, my experience with that was they tended to only tell me the poster children, the poster students, the ones that were, here is our top-notch students, and this could be you. That's the recruiting tool. But now part of the challenge is, now that's my comparison reference. And I think if I'm not doing what that student does, then there must be something wrong with me. So I'll give you an anecdote of this. My collaborator on this research, he's a professor, he's a management professor, and he did his PhD at Michigan, University of Michigan. And his advisor was a top-notch advisor. And his advisor's previous student, so the student that was right before him as her student, is just a phenom. he graduated his PhD in 3 years. He's now a professor at Wharton. He's actually my age, and he's gotten every accolade. His name's Adam Grant. He's not like a real popular, famous person. He writes books and stuff, and yeah. And that was his advisor's previous student. And then he comes in as the next student. And now he's thinking, oh man, that's what I have to live up to, is this guy? Yeah, that can be super tough. And it's about who we choose as our comparison reference. Now, a lot of you, well, I should say, a few of you talked about this, and they said, I feel this when I'm talking to others in my school or people in your cohort. I want to ask you a little bit about that. Why do you think you're feeling that when you're talking to others in your cohort? So I know Melissa had this comment. I know somebody else had this comment. Why do you think you're feeling it when you're talking to others? If you could actually scroll down on that. There you go. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Okay, so yes, I see that. I've seen some of these other comments. Older than the cohort from Jeannie. Okay, and Medina, mine comes from job applications. Yeah, when I read all the eligibility criteria, I see exactly how I could meet many of them, but feel anxiety about applying because I understand I'm not as progressed as these as I wanted to be. Yeah, great. Yeah, keep scrolling down here. I'm just reading your comments here. Here's actually something that I think is interesting. Because I remember when I was on the job market for an academic position, I knew my cohort of other graduates. And these other graduates, and these might have been from students from other schools. And when I could actually go and look at their CV, I could pull it up and I'd say, oh my gosh, they've got these publications. They look so great. And then I look at my own CV and I'm like, yeah, I have publications, but I know that these are like so lucky for me to get these things. And so when we look at somebody else's resume, all we really see is their successes. When we look at our own resume, we know the backstory. We know all the things behind it. So this is one of these problems that happens with social comparison. In my own research, with these accounting students, so we did a qualitative component to that research where we actually did these interviews, but we also did a quantitative component to our research. And so what we did is we took students in this prestigious accounting program, and they had a cohort, so they had basically all the same classes with all the other students. And we actually did some network analysis. So we asked the students, we said, of all the people in your classes, and we gave them each name of the people in their class, and they'd say, who do you ask for help? Who do you ask for support in the class? And of course, now we get a measurement of, it's kind of this network measure, but they call it in degree and out degree, but basically we're able to figure out who is asking for more help from all the students, but then also proportionate to how many people are asking them for help. So for instance, if we were to do this with the people here in this room, and I'm filling this out, and I say, okay, I get help. I ask David for help. I ask Deb for support, and I ask everybody else for support. And then they're all responding too, and none of them are asking me for support. And so, what does that do for me? And what we'd actually find is when people would search and seek for support within their cohort of people, they actually would feel more like imposters. Because what happens when I go to David and I say, I don't understand this homework. Do you know how to do this? And he just says, yeah, I know how to do this. Just do this and this and this. Now I think, oh my goodness, he's got it down. He's got it figured out. I don't know what's going on. And so this can be problematic. Another thing though that we measured was support from outside of the system. So outside of your peers. So this could have been even professors, family members as well, or other close relationships. And we would find that people who sought for support from outside of their cohort or outside of their peers, they actually felt less like an imposter. You can imagine this, going back to this MIT experience of these students. If they're asking all their other MIT people their other classmates, they might say, yeah, I know how to do this, I know how to do this. But if they go and they go to their family member and say, I'm really struggling here, like this is really hard, they'll help them. They'll lift them up. They'll say, let's get this in perspective. You are really doing great. And they tend to help them with this. So here's a comment from John. He says, I especially feel this way when I'm answering the question in the job interview. What are your salary requirements? I seem to instinctively undervalue myself. So this is actually another aspect of this research. So you guys may have heard of this concept called Dunning-Kruger or Kruger-Dunning effect. And it's basically overconfidence. It's the idea that people think that they're better than what they actually are. On the other side of this coin is the imposter syndrome. So they actually, and what they find is, with this research, is the poor performers are the ones that always think that they're better than what they are. So if I'm in the bottom 30th percentile of my class and they say, what percentile do you think you are? And I say, oh, you know what? I think I'm above average. I think I'm 60, 70 percentile, which is way off. But when they ask the people who are in the 80th percentile or 90th percentile, say, hey, where do you think you are? They say, they also say they're above average, but not that high above average. So they devalue themselves as well. All right, so Ryan brings up an interesting point here too. I often feel better talking to my court because they typically feel the same way that I am, and I feel a little less alone. So this is a really good comment because, and we found this a little bit within our research as well, is that people were actually willing to share the vulnerabilities. Then cohorts were actually helpful in that regard. Just for the exact same reasons Ryan says, then you feel less alone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Good, and I'm glad. And this is one of the reasons why I ask, has anybody ever felt this way? So we can normalize the feeling, so we can understand, oh, yeah, this is pretty normal. We've talked about social comparisons a little bit. In terms of the research with social comparisons, we often make what we say upwards comparisons. We want to compare ourselves to people that are better than us. And one of these problems is we compare our worst with somebody else's best. And that becomes a problem. This is that idea when I said, oh, you look at somebody else's resume, you see all their accomplishments, and you look at yours and you're like, yeah, I know I'm kind of padding my resume a little bit. We don't have all the information about other people. And then downward comparisons, this is an idea where we say, at least I'm not as bad as this other person. And that can help. It can provide some short-term relief, but it can lead to actual burnout. There's too much with the social comparison and the downward comparison. A different strategy here is maybe gratitude for the positives. And this gets to the idea of internalizing the successes. You can even do this with a gratitude diary. There's a lot of positive psychology research that uses this method. So they'll have people just, all you do is every day you kind of write what you're grateful for that day. And you be specific about what it is that you're grateful for. It's not just like, oh, today I'm happy for blue skies. You know, you actually internalize and think about, you know, what it is that you're grateful for. And they actually find that this actually helps. People give their enthusiasm and joy, especially for those who are engaging in downward comparisons here. So that can be a technique to kind of block the social comparisons. When we think about this linear career paths, their successes, what people think it looks like, what it really looks like here, and I think that's important for us to remember. I'm not going to go into this. Actually, Jamie had my class last night. We talked about this with resume of failures versus resume of successes. I've kind of already talked about that. But let's talk about this. So one thing that we can do is adjust our social comparisons. Now, one of the solutions that MIT has done is to eliminate grades for their freshmen. So it's pass fail. And this is adjusting those social comparisons. So in other words, if you get these new students who are used to getting straight A's, and now they're in a different pool of performers where they're inevitably not going to be the top performers all the time, they might say, oh, how do I cope with getting a B? Last time I got a B was in second grade. I don't even know what to do with this. So instead, for that first semester, while the students start to normalize themselves, they just say, you know what, it's pass fail. We're not giving you letter grades. We're just going to say, yeah, you passed, good job. Or maybe you need to reevaluate, if you're doing on the fail component. So that helps people to adjust their social comparisons and the benchmarks. Sharing feelings, and this goes back to, I think it was Ryan's comment about this, where he finds that if he shares these feelings, he might actually get other people to say, yeah, you know what, I felt that way too. So this is something that is interesting in the research I'm currently doing. We're doing this with entrepreneurs. So you can imagine entrepreneurs, they're trying to project confidence all the time. They're needing funding, there's so much ambiguity in being an entrepreneur. And these are entrepreneurs that maybe are their first time entrepreneurs, or this is kind of their second, third venture. They still have these issues. And in talking to these entrepreneurs, one thing that I'm finding in this research is they all say, oh yeah, we love to hear about other people's struggles with it. But at the same time, they also say, because we ask them, we say, who would you share these feelings with? And they say, nobody. I don't want to share it with anybody. And if they do, it's, maybe with their spouse or maybe a close associate, definitely not an investor and definitely not an employee. They're not going to do this. They're not going to say, oh, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just kind of making it up on the go. Now, this is interesting, and it's a little bit of a paradox because people, they want to hear the stories, but they don't want to share them. And there's actually some interesting research that shows that we actually learn a little bit better from other people's mistakes than our own. Because if we make a mistake, yes, it's going to sting and it's going to hurt. And we might even just withdraw from whatever that caused us to make that mistake. But we don't want to revisit it for self-preservation purposes. We don't want to dwell on our failures. But you know what? I'm really happy to learn about somebody else's failures. And then I can really learn, oh, this is how I avoid that mistake. Because we're not internalizing the mistake ourselves. We didn't make it. So this is kind of an interesting aspect here is we benefit from sharing, but nobody wants to share. So this is where we ask these entrepreneurs too, we say, what would you tell somebody that were to come to you? Say an employee would come to you and say, I don't know that I belong here. What should I do? And almost always their consistent answers are, one, they say, I would listen to them, see what the source of that feeling is. And two, they would try to normalize the feeling. And they'd say, I felt that way. All these people feel this way. Like, just join the club. And this is okay to feel this way. We've actually talked to the people in the med school here too. The people who deal with admitting students and also deal with placing their students into residencies. And they said with the med students, this is of course an issue that they deal with. They say that just kind of, it's not always a talked about issue. And one of the things, going back to maybe a socialization process, the medical student people, they shared with me that one of the people who used to do the orientation for their new students, he actually was a professor, in the med school, and he would share with them the first day orientation, his path of medicine. And it was one of these squiggly lines. And he just said, yeah, these are the things that I screwed up, and these are the mistakes that I made. And that's normal, and that's okay. We want to learn from these mistakes. That's one of the things that I even share with people, in the academic world about this for my own path. When I applied to PhD programs, I went to Texas A&M for my PhD, and when people would say, hey, why did you choose Texas A&M? My response was, they let me in. Because none of the other schools I applied to let me in. I applied to about a dozen schools. Now, this was during the recession, so there's some schools that just said, we're not admitting anybody because we don't have funding. But, so that happened. And then the similar thing happened even when I was going on the job market. I didn't have a lot of offers. I didn't even have a lot of job talks. Now, here's the conundrum about it is my performance is actually pretty good. But for whatever reason, the stars don't align, and that happens. And it can really, have me thinking, do I even belong in academics? It feels like academics keeps rejecting me. And of course, we all know about rejection, especially with our own research, rejected manuscripts. Rejection is actually, I think, the most shared experience among academics. It's not successes, it's rejections. It is definitely the most common, but we don't necessarily talk about them as much. One thing that we also found was sometimes people need to cognitively escape, but make sure that you can re-engage. So in other words, we had this student who had the video game problem. The video games was a cognitive escape for him. But the problem he could not re-engage with the task. He could not re-engage with the situation. We had other participants in our interviews, and they would say, yeah, I would do things to cognitively escape, but they would make sure that they re-engage. It's kind of just taking a break, recalibrating yourself a little bit, but make sure that you do it in a way that you can re-engage in the task. Don't get down the spiral, destructive spiral. We talked about this already too, seeking support from people outside. So maybe not from your cohorts. Maybe it's seeking support from other people outside of your cohort. Maybe it's even groups like this within the grad academy where you have people that are in other colleges within the university that might be going through the same experience. It's almost like little support groups a little bit. But I think it's important to understand that this stuff is pretty common, pretty normal. And respond better to the seeming failures. And I say seeming failures here because oftentimes our failures are not failures. So I remember I was actually teaching students, and it was in that prestigious accounting program that we collected our data in. And I had a student in my office who did badly on an exam, and it was my exam, and it's the first exam for the semester. And she came into my office and she was just like, I don't know what to do. I've never gotten a C on an exam before. Should I drop out of the program? And she was literally in tears about this. And I had to kind of say, this is one exam. Like this is one portion of your grade in one class of your program. And you're thinking about dropping. And the funny thing about it was my class is an organizational behavior class to accounting students. It's not even really part of their program. It's a required course that they have to take. It has nothing to do with, what they'll be doing on a day-to-day profession as they get a job. So try to respond to seeming failures. Also believe others when they say you're doing well. This is kind of an interesting thing is we, for some reason, we don't believe others when they say, hey, you're really good, or you are admitted, or even congratulations. If you've ever had an admission letter and all of you have, obviously, you're in school here, but it always says, hey, congratulations, you did this. We think that you're great. Believe it. Actually internalize that and celebrate it. I think that's important. Another thing to keep in mind is even if you're still feeling like this kind of imposter feeling, there are some, I guess, maybe positive externalities to it, kind of positive side effects. So there's actually some pretty recent research about this where they actually found that people who felt like imposters, they were viewed by their managers as more interpersonally capable. That they're actually better at relating with people because they had an other-oriented focus. Now that's I guess maybe the double edge of social comparison. If you are engaging in social comparison, that can be obviously a destructive thing, but it also can be a beneficial thing because now you're actually thinking of others all the time. And managers actually might view that as, hey, this person is interpersonally pretty good. And so even if you might be struggling with this and feeling it this way, understand that your bosses may not think that you're bad. They actually might think that you're interpersonally pretty effective and that you're other oriented, which can be pretty beneficial. Okay, yeah, question.
So I struggle with this or a lot of times because you can cope with imposter syndrome by doing better. Some too. Do you find, and I want to focus on these ones, but that's always in the back of my head. It's like I could deal with my imposter syndrome by also.
Yeah. So this is a great point because it brings in the performance component. Because you might actually have people who maybe they feel like imposters because they actually are doing badly, like they're performing badly. And a way to solve that is, well, just perform better, and then you won't feel that way. This is one interesting thing. When we did our study with these accounting students, we actually collected their grades for that semester, for that first semester, and we used that as a control variable. We were like, you know what? Maybe they're feeling like an imposters for good reasons. Maybe it's because they're not doing well. Maybe it's because they are failing in class. But what we found actually was their performance was unrelated to their feelings of imposterism. So even the high performers felt this way, and even low performers felt this way, but there was no kind of difference. And performance was not a predictor of them feeling this way. And I think even past research would also again suggest maybe even the high performers are the ones that are more likely to think they're not as good as what they actually are. But yeah, certainly, and this is what I would say too is when we talk about coping mechanisms for stress or problem coping, one is just to make us feel better, and the other is more targeted towards, well, what's the source of the problem? So the making you feel better, this is a lot of this in terms of, well, maybe I'll adjust my comparisons. But if I want to actually solve the problem, maybe it's I need to have better study habits. Maybe I need to have better about my time, because we know that as grad students, time is very fluid, and we have a lot of autonomy about what we can do. And I think those can actually be helpful techniques. One thing that we also investigated with our research was if there was a curvilinear relationship. Maybe there's a healthy sense of imposter feelings. Maybe actually, and we looked at this with performance. Now, we actually didn't find it to be quite significant, but there was a little bit of a trend. So if you're feeling like, oh, maybe I'm not that good, maybe there's a healthy feeling of that to where you're actually going to perform better. But then it can dissipate. If you let that consume your life, then your performance can actually be going down, going badly. So yeah, does that answer kind of your question a little bit? Yeah, so yeah, we found that to be quite interesting. Was performance actually was unrelated to people's feelings of imposterism. It had more to do with where they were seeking support. Okay, cool. So what other questions? I'm curious, what questions maybe that you have about this? One thing I would say too is there is research about this, whether imposter syndrome, if it's like just a personality trait, if people feel this way just perpetually, or if it's under certain situations. And what we kind of find is it is a little bit of a state, meaning it's specific to a context. And of course, as you can imagine, it can go away through time. So these freshmen at MIT, by the time they're seniors, they feel less like an imposter. Like, you know what? I've got this down. This is okay. Even if they're not really the top of their class, they've normalized themselves. But then, of course, we know that they're going to start something else new. And whenever we start something new, whenever there's that uncertainty, that can lead to this unknowing, how do I stand? Are people just kind of looking at me in a microscope? And I'll tell you, they often are not. So there's some social psychologists that did some research on what they call the spotlight effect. And it's this idea that people think that other people always see them and view them. And so what they did actually in these studies is they had people go into like a social setting with a really funky shirt on. That would make you feel uncomfortable. You're like, oh man, this is so embarrassing. I'm wearing this weird shirt. Everybody's gonna notice this. And of course, the person has all this anxiety about their shirt being noticed. But then they ask all the people in the room, they're like, hey, did you notice anything weird? Did you notice anything strange? And guess what? No, they don't. We're not actually on stage all the time, even though we think that we are. And I think that's also another important thing to think about is we might be thinking other people are evaluating us constantly, like your advisor and all these people. And yeah, they might be, but they're likely pretty busy people. They've got a lot of other things to do and to worry about. And you're part of it for sure, but not the whole picture that way.
I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So I don't suffer with imposter syndrome. However, my big brother does. He graduated from the Boyd School of Law, first in his class, magna cum laude, like great GPA. He works with the Attorney General's office now. I mean, he's just very successful, and he talks about these feelings of imposter syndrome. What can I do? Like, what can I tell him? You know, like, how do I respond as a person that he's confiding in?
Yeah, so this is actually a great question. This is a question that me and my collaborator are trying to answer a little bit. Because we want to know, much of the research on imposter syndrome has been, how does an individual cope with it? But we also want to give tools to managers, perhaps, or other people to say, what happens if an employee comes to me or a friend comes to me and says, I'm feeling this way? What can they do? So that's a great question. Some potential solutions or potential kind of toolkits. One is, again, this sharing the feelings. Now, obviously, you're like, you haven't felt this way, perhaps, but you probably know of somebody else that maybe is real accomplished. Like, this is kind of normal. Like, that's all right. So try to figure out some way to normalize the feelings. And again, when we ask the entrepreneurs this question, like, what would you do? I think the first thing is listen. And see if you can actually, and they always say, we try to find the source of it. Why is it that you're feeling this way? And so maybe that's something that you can do too. And because that can be an exercise that maybe your brother's not actually done. To think, and even asking you guys, participating here, I said, why do you think you might feel that way? Some of you say, yeah, I feel that way, but I don't know why. Because maybe you haven't actually gone through an exercise of, well, when do I feel this way? What are episodes of this feeling? And how can I actually then cope with this a little bit? And of course, I would also say accentuate positive. So when your brother is doing good things, make sure he knows that he can internalize those successes, because he obviously has lots of them. But he might be like, I just got lucky or whatever. But let him know that no, you actually accomplished these things. So I think that's important to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Are there any other questions out there about imposter syndrome and even careers in academics? And that's okay if you don't have any questions. I know that the questions often come later, but
I feel like past successes only help so much.
what's that?
I feel like past successes only help so much. I'm constantly like looking for a new success.
Yeah.
And in academia, we get so few, like there's so few and far between.
Right.
What are do you have suggestions of smaller successes that we can focus on?
Yeah, so this is actually, so I remember a guy when I was a PhD student, he came and visited, he gave a talk, this highly successful researcher with just multiple top tier publications and distinguished professor, all that kind of stuff, lifetime achievement award kind of guy. And when he was talking to us PhD students, he said, I'm one rejection away from being a failure. Like that was his mindset. Even though he had done all these great things, he's just like, well, what's the next thing? And this is where actually I think, and one thing that I think is important to think about too, and you'll notice this as you go further in your career is so like for myself, does getting another A publication or top publication, does it do it for me as much as it did when I was a student or, an assistant professor? Not as much, and so maybe there's actually other things that are going to give me that intrinsic satisfaction so maybe it's not just the matter of like, oh, what's my next success, but what is the realm of your next success even? And it could be the research component. It could be, oh, I'm now going to be a mentor. Maybe it's the placement of your PhD student. It's going to be your source of success or satisfaction. So I think that's an important thing is to think about it in those terms of not just what's my next success or like what's my next publication going to be, but maybe the success can come in a different realm that becomes more interesting. So I just talked with a guy last week. He was out here visiting, and he's another one of these kind of Hall of Fame professors in my management field. And he said that he was a quantitative researcher trained, but now he almost exclusively does qualitative work. And he was telling me, he's like, everything just became alive to me. After this is after he had tenure and all this stuff. He's like, I did quantitative research, but then, that just kind of lost its luster for me. And so he switched it to qualitative. He's like, oh, this is giving me new life into my career. So I think that can be an important component to it. Yeah, here's Jamie says, is there research on imposter syndrome in other contexts than work, school? Like being a parent. Yeah, there is actually, I think. So some history with imposter research, it started in a work context. It actually started with women in a work context and how they might be feeling this way. That was back in the 70s. Then most of the research was in a academic, student aspect, but I think there is research like being a parent that Jamie's kind of bringing up. And this goes even into the different realms of our life. You might not feel like an imposter at work, but you might feel like an imposter with your family. Like, oh, I don't know what I'm doing raising kids. Or it might be kind of the other way around. But I think there is. I can't think of one off the bat, but to give to you, but I think there is a little bit of research in that with parenting. Yeah. Good question. All right. Any other questions out there? So just know that you're all imposters. That's the takeaway. We're all there. No, the takeaway is that we're not imposters. You do belong here. We use this adage of fake it till you make it. And that might help. That might be a successful kind of cognitive tool for yourself to say, oh, I'm just faking it until I make it. But if I were to kind of get technical about it, I would say, don't fake it till you make it. You've already made it. Like, you're already here. You're already in your program. You're already learning things. Yes, do you have a lot more to do and a lot more to learn? Absolutely. And that's part of the process. But there's nothing for you to fake. We've already interviewed you. We've already looked at you. We like these directions, that you're going. So yeah, highlight it and stick to it. Keep learning and don't let little setbacks make you make kind of rash decisions. Yeah. Great. Well, if you guys have other questions or need anything else, that's my email. You can find me obviously online at the UNLV websites and stuff. You just Google my name and I'm there. So excellent. So hopefully this has been a little bit helpful for you. I always like to see what's going on in the lives of our graduate students, and so hopefully this can be a good resource for you. And thanks for your time.
Thank you.